everyone, and welcome to this episode of Now Unmanned, the podcast on men, masculinities, and gender equality. I'm Stephen Burrell. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'm here with my co-host Sandy Ruxton, as always. How are things in the UK for you, Sandy?
Good, Stephen, but there's been a lot of discussion here, and I think elsewhere, about young men, including, in particular, the Netflix series Adolescence, and also the former England football manager, Gareth Southgate's given a Dimbleby lecture, which again was about young men and their upbringing. So there's quite a lot of discussion on masculinities here.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's definitely filtered through here in Australia as well. So it's very timely to be recording this episode. And we're really delighted to have with us Jackson Katz back on the podcast. Our previous conversation with Jackson a couple of years ago now is one of our most popular episodes to date. And he's just written a really important new book called Every Man: Why Violence Against Women is a Men's Issue and How You Can Make a Difference. We're going to talk to Jackson about that and also what's been happening politically in the US, if there's time, and the turbulent times that we're all living through at the moment and how that relates to men and masculinities.
As many of you will know, Jackson is an educator, speaker and writer who's internationally renowned for his groundbreaking work on issues of gender, race and violence. His TEDx talk, Violence Against Women, It's a Men's Issue, has been watched over 5.5 million times. He co-founded the pioneering program Mentors in Violence Prevention, which was the first large-scale prevention program in sports culture and all branches of the US military, and it's been rolled out in schools and universities across the US and parts of the UK. So, hi Jackson, it's great to have you back on the podcast.
Hi Sandy and Stephen, it's great to be back on your podcast. I'm a big fan, and I'm very honored and excited to be back in dialogue with you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for coming on. We'll talk about your book in a minute, but before we do so, we wanted to ask you briefly about the Netflix show Adolescence, which portrays the social media-fueled killing of a female school pupil by a 13-year-old boy in the UK. And this is generating huge discussion of issues around men, fatherhood, boys, social media, the manosphere here in the UK, and I think across the English-speaking world at least, if not beyond. And I just wondered what you made of that program, and how should we go about counteracting the hugely damaging and growing impact of social media and the manosphere on young men?
Well, I think the Adolescence Netflix series is an enormously important, teachable moment for our work more generally, and I wouldn't want to limit it just to discussion about incels and the sort of online radicalization of young men. I think it's much bigger than that, and I think there are a number of factors and reasons why it's such an incredibly useful sort of piece of art, if you will, televisual art that illuminates real life in ways that are profoundly moving, as well as opening up space for these kinds of conversations. And I've been doing lots of media discussions. I mean, people have been writing about this and speaking about it, and it's a kind of unusually powerful moment. Okay, so I think that's the first thing. But I think one of the reasons why it's so powerful, there's many, but one of the reasons is because it really does center this boy's family, and in particular his father and the father's relationship to his son, around his feelings of failure, the father's feelings of failure for having failed to protect his son. And of course, the girl, the young woman who was murdered in the storyline, I hope I'm not giving this away because most people listening,
there is that.
Well, most people listening,
they'll know that.
Will know that. That's right. And I think the fact that the storyline focused on the boy and his family is one of the reasons why it's gotten so much attention. And I don't think that that's to the negation of the girls and women's experience. I think that that's what Stephen Graham, the writer and the co-writer, were intending to do. And I think it's kind of a man bites dog story. In other words, it's focusing on something that people don't normally focus on, which is why did this guy do it, rather than the impact of what he had done. It's like, why did he do it, and what are the forces at work in his life? And of course, the online manosphere, the misogynist manosphere, is, while it's not explicitly discussed very much, it sort of hovers there in the background throughout the whole narrative. And that it's, this influential force in the lives of young people, but it's not necessarily explored in depth. And I don't think that's the burden of the filmmakers and of the creators of the artistic piece. They did their job, which is to make this very powerful, moving story that touched on a whole range of different issues. And our job is to take that, the work that we do, those of us who work with men and boys, who are working against men's violence against women, our job is to take the interest that's generated, the emotional connection that so many people feel to that story, including so many men who are fathers, and to take that and generate something more, productive and useful out of it. And one of the pieces that I'm writing right now is about how it is a mistake to just focus on the small number of young men who get online, radicalized online and go right down the dark, path towards incel culture, although that's a real issue. I think that misogyny is much more broadly distributed across the population, if you will, and its effects are just pervasive, if you will, on the lives of women and girls, but also men and boys and others. And I think that gives us the opportunity to talk about that. And by the way, Stephen Graham, as both a public person, if you will, an actor, and obviously the creator and the co-writer of the show, I think he understands, without having the language that we have, he understands that what he did was to flip the script a little bit in a way that opened up new pathways for understanding. And my hat's off to him. I mean, I'm very impressed by the whole project.
No, I agree. I mean, it's an incredibly powerful piece of work, really. And I saw today, I think, that UK government has agreed with Netflix that it can be shown in UK schools for free. So hopefully it could be a talking point in schools as well. So.
Well, and I think that's great. And I think that would be great to have groups of adults watching it together.
Sure.
And not just kids and teachers. It should be in teacher training. It should be in parent training. It should be in, all kinds of settings where adults are the primary audience, and then have organized discussions after the screening, if you will. I don't know how practical that is, but I'm just saying it's not just the kids who need to be having this dialogue, it's the adults. And I think especially the men, because again, women have been talking about this stuff. Women have been trying to raise consciousness. Women have been pushing in a multiracial, multi-ethnic sense in the UK, all over the world. Women have been the world historical transformative leaders in the gender violence prevention world for the last, half century and then centuries, prior, but certainly the past half century. And that's not going to change. I mean, women are continuing to be at the forefront, but I think this piece opens up the possibility that we can actually dramatically increase the number of men who engage in that conversation, and men who see themselves as good men, as responsible people, as responsible fathers in some cases. I mean, that's another reason why the Stephen Graham character in the film, I think, is so resonant. Is that he's a normal guy. He's a plumber. He's a family guy. He sees himself as being a responsible person, and he's kind of filled with sadness and grief that what he thought he was doing was adequate to transmit to his kids what he didn't get from his father, for example, and it didn't work out for him, and I think a lot of people watching that, including a lot of men. Again, I know women watching it, they can relate to the woman and the man. It's not exclusive. Just because I'm centering the man doesn't mean that I'm not saying that there aren't other storylines that are and identities that are being represented and touched on. But I do think that a lot of men can relate to this guy, because I think a lot of men, and in fact, I have to say, my book, Every Man, the target audience, if there is such a thing, I think it's as broad as I can make it, but it's not like men who are abusive. It's like all men, every man. It's men who see themselves as good men. It's men who see themselves as responsible, good people, who will say about the issues of gender-based violence, "Oh, this isn't really my issue. I don't rape women. I don't assault my wife or girlfriend. I treat women with respect." You need to be talking to those men, the ones who are horrible, or the ones who've got problems and who are doing these horrible things. And I've been hearing that. All of us who do this work have been hearing that for decades. And it goes nowhere, because what ends up happening is so many men who are in positions of influence, whether it's in their family, in their community, in their workplace, politics, and business, and every other domain, all these men who have influence will say, just because they personally don't engage in these abusive behaviors, then somehow it's not their issue. And I'm trying to counteract that with the very name of my book, Every Man. And I think that Adolescence does that in its own way as a piece of televisual art.
Sure. I mean, in a way, the fact that if people have seen the show, they should also look at your book at the same time, because they are closely linked, as you've just explained. And I mean, it's amazing in a way that you've had such a struggle to get a book about men's violence against women as a men's issue, or an issue for men, published by a mainstream publisher, and now that's happening. So, I wondered if you wanted to say something about that.
Oh my goodness, Sandy. Yes, I do. I have to tell you, it's an uphill fight. It's been an uphill fight for me for 30 years trying to get a book published by a mainstream publisher about men's violence against women as a men's issue, and I've run into roadblock after roadblock, and I'm sure other people have as well. It's not that people haven't written books. It's not that men haven't written books about men's violence against women, but they're not published by mainstream publishers. They tend to be published by small independent presses or academic presses, which have very limited reach, very limited press runs, and therefore the average person, whether it's the book buying public or, people in media watching, television or listening to podcasts or prior to that, listening to, radio, whatever it is, they don't even know that we exist. They don't even know that there are men out there who have been engaging with this subject matter, who have been working with men, for example, I'm talking about in educational spaces, as prevention education, in all these different areas for decades, not years, but for decades. And I have to say, I'm in a vantage point that, not that many people are in. I travel constantly. I'm speaking to thousands of people. I've been doing this for years. And I hear constantly from people, especially in this case, women, who will say, oh my God, I've never heard a man say these things before. Oh my God, I didn't know there were men who cared. Oh my God, I've been waiting my whole life to hear a man say, X, Y, and Z, or, about gender-based violence as a men's issue, men's responsibility, misogyny, that men have to own misogyny, all that kind of stuff. And I say, on one level, I appreciate that they're being appreciative. I'm not going to deny that. But at the same time, I think it's sad that they have never heard this. And I say, listen, I'm not the only one who's been saying this, and I've been out there for decades. It's not like just yesterday that I started speaking out, and it's not like there's been a multiracial, multi-ethnic, global movement of men dealing with this stuff since the 70s. But we haven't had the platform. We haven't had access. And one of the reasons is because the publishing industry, and I'll just say this, the publishing industry has had the conventional wisdom in the mainstream publishing industry is there's no market for a thoughtful discussion about men's violence against women from the point of view of men, and thinking about, written by a man. And as a result of that, we don't have these conversations. So the people who go on book tours, who go out and talk about their books, who are interviewed by people on the radio and on podcasts and on television, when's the last time you heard a man talk about this subject who's written a book about it, who's making the rounds of the talk shows? It's never happened. And as a result, I think there's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because one of the reasons men don't speak up about this subject is because other men don't speak up about this subject. And I think a lot of men are very, very anxious and self-conscious that they're going to say the wrong thing. Other men are going to think they're soft or weak or something, or that feminist women are going to resent them. There's all these reasons why men don't speak up. And if they don't hear other men speaking up, it doesn't give them any sort of support in the sense that they know that they're speaking for a broader, public. I'm just saying, as a man who's been doing this work and who's been speaking with and to men and women and others for decades, men can hear these things. There's tons of men out there who agree with most of what I'm saying, who may not agree with every single point of my sort of ideological position on every issue. I'm not saying that, but who agree generally that men need to speak up, that this is a real important issue, that this is not anti-male to say any of these things, who want to have intersectional, racially sophisticated and ethnically, integrated and sophisticated and global sort of perspectives on this subject. Yes, but I think there's an awful lot of men who, when they hear men like me or yourselves talk about this subject matter, they don't think, oh my God, I hate these people, I can't stand them, they don't have any idea what they're talking about. I think there's a lot of men who resonate with a lot of this, but they haven't had the exposure to others who feel that way.
I mean, so you've got this fundamental, incredibly important and powerful message that every man has a role to play here. And as you said, many men will be supportive of that, but many may also feel like some feelings of defensiveness. And I think it's important to say, isn't it? We all feel those feelings of defensiveness sometimes. This is uncomfortable for all of us, no matter how long you may be involved in this work, because I suppose it's fundamentally bringing into question the ways in which we're brought up to see and understand the world, isn't it? And I suppose you see that defensiveness embodied in hashtags like not all men. So why is it, that we as men react like this sometimes? And, what is it that's holding us back from taking action in your view? And how can we help men to move past that, and to move past that defensiveness and start to play a more active role in making a difference?
Well, one thing I would say, Stephen, is it's very similar. Not exactly, but there's lots of overlap with white people and racism. I think a lot of white people feel uncomfortable talking about racism and about white privilege, if you will, and all the ways in which it plays out. And I think the way that people in dominant groups often deal with the anxiety that they feel when they have a certain consciousness about their responsibility vis-a-vis, racial justice or gender justice or any other forms of oppression. If they belong to the dominant group, I think those who are conscious and have a conscience about their responsibility often retreat in the face of the anxiety that they feel about these issues. And they say, okay, if I'm just going to take care of business in my personal life, in my family, I'm going to be a good person, but I don't really feel comfortable talking about this stuff more broadly. And I think this is what's going on for a lot of men. I think a lot of men agree that men's violence against women is a really big problem, that the status quo is not acceptable, but they don't really know what to say. And yes, I do agree that many men do initially feel defensive. And again, I feel I can be defensive too. Not in the early stages, maybe I was more defensive than I am now, but I understand defensiveness. And I address this throughout my book, Every Man. So for example, one of the ways to deal with the defensiveness that so many men feel is to, number one, acknowledge it and say, we understand. Of course, we're going to feel defensive sometimes, but I also invoke and I write about the triad of men's violence, which Michael Kaufman wrote about in an essay in 1987. And it's shocking, but 1987 is almost 40 years ago. So Michael Kaufman, one of the co-founders of the White Ribbon Campaign and an important figure in our field, when he wrote The Triad of Men's Violence, what he was doing was connecting men's violence against women to men's violence against other men to men's violence against themselves, which is, because suicide is violence turned inward. And these are all connected. And I and others in my gender violence prevention work have been using this conceptually and practically for 40 years. Okay, so again, this is not something brand new. But we're introducing it to a broader audience. And the reason why I say that is because so many men have experienced violence in their life from other men, whether it's violent fathers or older brothers, or certainly on the playground or in childhood, adolescence. It could be sexual abuse. I mean, there's so many ways that men and young men have experienced violence at the hands of other men, and many of those men have never begun to even think that that's connected to men's violence against women. And they'll say, well, what about when those men will hear, some of those men, when they hear talk about men's violence against women, they'll say, well, what about violence against men? What about all the men who are experiencing violence? And I often say, as if we hadn't thought of that. Oh, that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. It's like, of course we thought of that. This has been built into our work from the beginning. And when you start making these connections, I think you start reducing some of the defensiveness and you start finding points of empathy, because guys know what it's like to fear men, because both women and men fear men. And one of the unspoken, sort of realities of, or I would say dirty little secrets of traditional or hegemonic masculinity is that men are afraid of each other. So many men are afraid of each other. Some can articulate that out loud and many can't, but men do live in fear of each other. And sometimes the fear is racialized. Sometimes the fear is geographically specific. Some of it's class-based. I mean, there's global north and global south kind of complexities to all of this. We have to acknowledge. But the fear that so many men live in of other men's violence is a real thing. And by connecting that to men's violence against women, it goes a long way to reducing defensiveness. And by the way, the thing about the men's violence against themselves, which is to say suicide being violence turned inward, this whole discussion about men's mental health, which has gotten lots of traction globally, and it's a really good thing because we're talking about this. And my friend Terry Real wrote a book, I Don't Want to Talk About It, in 1997. I think the first major book about men's depression, which is a brilliant piece of work, 1997. When you think about the growing consciousness about how many men suffer from, whether it's covert depression or other mental health challenges. We talk about the loneliness epidemic among young men in the UK, in the United States, and Australia, other countries, and how this is all connected. The movie, obviously, the show Adolescence has brought up some of these discussions about the challenges that boys have. If you can show people, including men, that feminist analyses are not their enemy, but they're actually their ally. They have to actually give them a way of thinking about these experiences that are potentially liberating and potentially elevating, rather than finger wagging criticisms. I think you begin to take away some of the defensiveness, because you're speaking a language that they can start relating to on a very direct level. That's what I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. And you talk about that in the book, about how it's ultimately beneficial for us as men to become involved in the struggle for gender equality. And of course, you have been doing this work for several decades now. So I was just wondering if you wanted to say anything about, the positive impact that it's had on you to be involved in this work. What positive impacts has feminism had on you, I suppose?
Oh, I mean, how long do we have? I would say it's just I can't imagine doing anything else. Right, and I honestly, from 19 years old, I didn't know exactly what I was going to do. I didn't know what exact trajectory my life would take and how I was going to make a living or anything like that. But from the time I was 19, I knew oh my God, this is so important. All this stuff is so important. When I was introduced to feminist ideas, I realized that, oh my God, this speaks to much broader than just men's violence against women or gender equality unto itself. Gender equality is marbled into every other system of injustice and inequality, and I understood its transformative impacts. By the way, not just on women, but on men. And I often say to people, when my first draw, if you will, to take courses at university on gender-related subjects, it wasn't altruistic impulse. It wasn't like, I'm going to go help women. It was more like I wanted to resolve some conflicts in my own psyche, in my own life, because I was this really good athlete as a young guy, especially American football. And on one level, I was publicly very successful. But on the other level, on my family, I had all kinds of problems and all kinds of sadnesses and longings that were unfulfilled. And I was like, I knew, I couldn't articulate this, but I knew that it had something to do with the strictures of traditional gender norms that I was both living and being subject to. And I also think it's important to say I was also the son of a man who was a medic in World War II, an army. My father was an army medic, United States Army in World War II, and he served in Germany and France, and he died at age 37 of a heart attack, and I never met him because he died when my mother was pregnant with me. And then I grew up with my stepfather, who was a badly damaged man. And he was a blue collar guy who was, devoted to taking care of his family, but he had, in terms of financially, but he had very limited skills. And he was also a veteran of the United States Army during World War II in Europe. And I'm not saying that those experiences of my father and stepfather are the only things about them that matter. I'm just saying I was also aware that I was coming of age just a few decades after the biggest cataclysm of violence and men's violence in human history, and World War II is just profoundly part of our lives and our lifetimes, and I also understood Nazism and Hitlerism and right-wing sort of populism as a hyper-masculinist movement, and I got that as a really young guy, and so I was turned on to both the ideas of feminism and the transformative impacts it had, much more broadly than just men's violence against women. Although when I graduated from university and I moved to Boston, my home city, I was like, I had to get involved with men's violence against women, preventing men's violence against women as the front line of promoting gender equality, because the crisis is like today. It's not like some theoretical future. It's like today. Men are assaulting women, and it doesn't have to be this way. And there's a system breakdown. There's all these systems that are contributing to the problem. How can I play a role in helping to shape that? So all of that, I think I get so much from this to your specific question, Stephen. I get so much back from all of this, both personally, like the rewards of doing work that I consider the opposite of alienated labor. This is not alienated labor. This is like my life, and I love this, and I've been able to make a living doing what I love as an activist, and being able to be part of the changes that are happening. Even though what's been happening, I know we'll get into this, in the United States is god awful, backward movement, and it's just horrible. But at the same time, being part of the struggle all these years has enormous value to me, and the kind of connections that I've made, the women, the friends, the colleagues, the men, the friends, the colleagues, and others. I mean, it's just, I can't imagine my life being any different in that sense. And not that I have resolved every conflict in my own psyche, or that I don't have issues, because I do. And I always say I'm a work in progress. I'm not some highly evolved man who's, don't got any issues. And I know I've been saying that because I know that people around me who know me well would say, if I didn't say that, they would say, you don't know the whole picture. This guy's got his own issues, and I'm sure I do. But goodness gracious, this is all like extraordinarily rewarding work.
Yeah, in a way, I mean, one of our first responsibilities as men is introspection, isn't it? I mean, as you just said. But I was interested when you mentioned World War II as well, actually, because. I mean, this is audio, so listeners can't see this, but there's a painting on the wall just behind me, which is my uncle, who was killed in the last months of the Second World War, and that fact has rippled through our family down the ages, and as you were describing, really. So, and it's kind of scary, the fact that we're going into a more militaristic period again as well, and kind of wondering where we're going. But,
God, by the way, God bless him. Even though I'm not a religious person, but God bless him.
Well, I've written about him, and I've written about his relationship with my grandfather as well, who I never knew. But you might find that interesting.
I will.
I'll put it in the show notes. But
thank you. And by the way, Sandy, I know again, as you said, it's audio and not video. But behind me on my bookshelf, I have a USGI helmet from World War II, and I have it as a sort of an icon of a sort of a symbol of resistance to tyranny, resistance to fascism, and active and not passive. It's active, and that's also a token of appreciation. All these young men who went and died.
Well, indeed, to
fight fascism.
It would be helpful if some of the people in the US government could remember our collaborative work, in defeating Nazism. But anyway. One of the people who originally created the bystander approach to preventing gender-based violence, Jackson. So what does that intervention look like, briefly, and what do you think are some of its strengths?
Well, the bystander approach, which my program, the Mentors in Violence Prevention program, introduced to the domestic and sexual violence prevention fields in the early 1990s, is a way of thinking about change within peer cultures, small and large, that focuses not on the perpetrators and the victims, but on everybody else. So it focuses on everybody around the person, doing bad things or causing harm, and everybody around the person experiencing it. And it tries to give people tools as well as support for speaking up and challenging and interrupting abusive behavior. And it also gives people tools and support for supporting people who are victimized or who are targets of harassment or abuse. And not just in terms of extreme manifestations of misogyny, like will you speak up if you see a rape happening, or interrupt a guy assaulting his girlfriend, but will you say something for if a guy is making sexist comments or misogynist comments about women in a group of men where there's no women present? What then will you say or do? And if you're not going to say anything or do anything, or haven't, let's talk about what you can do, and let's talk about some of the dynamics that are going on in peer cultures, in this case in male peer cultures, that keep men from acting even when they know that the behavior that they see is wrong. Because I think this is what's going on all over the place. I think there's lots of men and young men who know that some of the behavior around them is wrong, but they don't do anything about it. Now, some women and feminist women from the sort of outside of that setting will say, why don't they speak up? Why don't they do something? And I appreciate that, and I understand that. But there's reasons why they don't do it, and there's reasons that have to do with traditional socialization, and there's also a cost-benefit analysis that a lot of men and young men make, which is they think, if I speak up, if I do something, this could land badly on me. I could be taking a risk with in some cases, my personal safety. But I say more often, it's not about personal safety. It's not about physical courage that they lack. It's social courage because it's socially awkward. And I think, by the way, one of the reasons why the bystander approach can be confusing to people is because they often confuse it with the bystander effect, which is a social psychological concept about why people don't intervene in public spaces when they see violence, for example, on the tube or in the subway or on the streets. And the reason why people don't intervene in public is often because they're afraid of physical and violent retribution, which is realistic fear. And in the United States, with 400 million guns in circulation, people are petrified for good reason that if they speak up or they intervene, they could literally lose their life within a few seconds with a gunshot, right? Or a stab, if you know what I mean. But in the MVP model, the Mentors in Violence Prevention model, and as I teach the bystander approach, it's not about strangers on the street. It's about known peer cultures. It's about teams, athletic fraternities. It's about workplaces. It's about groups of guys hanging out. It's like the reason why guys don't speak up in those circumstances is usually not because of the fear of physical retribution. It's the fear of social awkwardness or potentially social retribution. And if you don't talk about any of this, right? In other words, if you're just giving a PowerPoint presentation and telling people what they need to do in such and such a situation, and you don't give space to have a dialogue about the dynamics that are going on in these peer cultures and the ways that men and young men police each other into conformist silence, then I think you're completely missing the point. My frustration, I have to say, about the way that the bystander approach has been taken on and taken up in parts of the world, including the United States, is that people have often degendered it and emptied it of its transformative potential by making it into what I refer to as a glorified nightclub bouncer training. And it's sort of like, if you see something, say something. And like, young people need to, self-deputize when they're at a party and they see a potential rape scenario. They need to figure out how to, organize to stop it from happening. And my thinking from the beginning wasn't about that. I mean, I think that's a good thing. I mean, I think people should figure out how to intervene and do it safely and smartly. But my thought from the beginning, when I introduced, the bystander approach and my program did to the field, it was more like, we got to create a space for young men to talk to each other, young women to talk to each other, women and men talking to each other, and people, non-binary, men, women, everybody. We need to create spaces where there's like dialogue about all these dynamics in these peer cultures. And it has to be complexified, not just by gender, but by race and ethnicity and social class. And it's dialogic. It's not a lecture. And even though I'm talking a lot in this conversation, I understand that it's what you're trying to aim for. And as an educator, as somebody who's run programs and written materials, you're going for dialogue and interactive discussion, because what you want is these young men, for example, if I'm talking about them, to hear from each other, not from the expert at the front of the room. You want them to hear from each other. You want some 16-year-old boy to hear another 16-year-old boy say, hey, I'm not cool with that either, but I'm not sure what to say in that situation. Because if he hears his friends say that, right, that another friend of his is also unhappy with the behavior of one of the guys in the group, then the next time it happens, he knows that if he says something or does something, he's not on his own. He's not the only one who's uncomfortable. But if those of us who are adults and educators and others, if we don't create the opportunity for them to have that dialogue, they're not going to have it. And so I think this is why the bystander approach, I think, has enormous potential that is not yet realized. I also want to say a last thing about that. The bystander who speaks up, and I use the word bystander as a synonym for friend, teammate, classmate, colleague, coworker, family member, anybody who's in a given peer culture, small or large, who's not in either abuser or the person experiencing abuse, is a bystander, okay? And by the way, you don't have to be there at the moment when an incident is happening. That's, again, a reductive understanding of a broader concept. You just have to be a member of the peer culture in some way, in the community in some way. But the person who speaks up, the 15-year-old boy who takes his friend aside and says, hey, the way you're talking to your girlfriend, I'm concerned about you. I don't really know what's going on, but I'm concerned about you, the kind of things you're saying to her. That boy, what has he just done? He's acted as a leader. That's a leadership act, what he's just done. He's not just being a good friend, although I think he is. He's not just being responsible to the young woman, which I think he is. I think he's also acting as a leader, because what is he doing? He's seeing a situation of harm. He's trying to figure out what his responsibilities are to the various parties, whether he's conscious of it or not. He's thinking about his responsibility to his friend, to the girl, to his own values. And then he's thinking, what are my options? What can I do in this situation? And then he's cycling through a series of options, and he's choosing one, which is to say something to my friend, and he's executing it. So what he's done, he's executed a very basic leadership protocol. And so the reason why I think this is helpful is that we're saying that we want young men, in this case, or older men, to be empowered or active bystanders. What we're really saying is we want them to be leaders. And by saying it in that way, it's framing it positively and aspirationally. It's not, again, it's not criticizing young men and saying, stop being toxic. It's saying we need more young men who have the courage and the strength to do and say the right thing.
You mentioned how it can be used in, for example, sports culture, but we know from what you said earlier that you've done a lot of work in the military as well. I mean, how have you managed to use this approach in the military? Is it the same or different? Or because that's obviously a very masculinized environment.
It's the same thing. I think there are some differences because, military structures, it's very authoritarian. It's, very hierarchical. So therefore, everybody's aware of, for example, status is very explicit. It's literally you're wearing it on your, on your arm. You know what I mean? Like people know what their relative status and relative place in the hierarchy, and it's very difficult to challenge somebody above you in the hierarchy. But the flip side is when you're talking about peer to peer, people who are, whether it's 24-year-old sergeants or 46-year-old colonels, they all have their own peer culture. They also have their responsibility in the chain of command, but they also have a sense of duty and honor and supposed, commitment to upholding certain basic values, which is you speak up in the face of injustice. And I know we can't get into it now, but the United States military has just completely under Donald Trump's presidency, 2.0 has completely retreated from all the forward progress we've been making, not just my program, but all kinds of programs in the military over the past generation. And I think it's ill-serving, not just women and girls in the women in the military or women and girls more generally, but it's ill-serving men and young men and everybody else who benefits from a workplace where people treat each other with respect and dignity and speak up. And by the way, in the U.S. military, a huge number of the victims of sexual violence are men who are the victims of other men's violence. So when we talk about eliminating, DEI training and eliminating any discussions about these issues, because the subtext of that is somehow it's unfair to men, which I don't agree with at all. What you're also saying is men as the victims and targets of abuse and harassment aren't really worthy either. It's really regressive. But I would say in the sports culture and the military culture, because of its hierarchical nature, and there's an authoritarian quality to these subcultures often, you can make change very quickly if you have the buy-in of the leadership. And the sports culture, this is another one that I and a lot of other people have been working in the sports culture for years, for decades. So when I started the MVP program in 1993, that's 32 years ago. Like from the beginning, I was like, you need buy-in from the athletic administrators, the coaches, the students, and the athletes are the ones who have the least power in these systems. And yet they're the ones who get all the attention. And yet the coaches and the administrators and the presidents of the universities in the States where we have a big, university athletic system, they're the ones who have all the power. And yet they take a pass often and they don't get trained and they don't initiate programming and that's an institutional failure. It's not the failure of the young people. It's not the failure of the athletes. It's the failure of the adults in charge. And again, Sandy, that's a political question. It's like people ask me, what are the biggest obstacles to the success of my work or gender violence prevention over the years? And it's not pedagogical. What they often assume when they ask the question is, it must be really hard talking to these like military guys, kind of macho guys or tough guys, or you're working with athletes and a lot of these guys are really full of themselves, they're entitled or whatever it is, whatever people's stereotypes are. But I say no, it's not pedagogical. The biggest obstacles by far are political. And the political obstacles are how do you get into systems and how do you get the powerful people in those systems to be held accountable for changing the climate and changing the culture by instituting programs, by instituting policies, by providing upfront and proactive leadership. And one of the things that I say throughout Every Man, my book, is this is a leadership issue flat out. And one of the reasons why we have had such a hard time making real forward progress in gender violence prevention, although we have made some forward progress, is because is because of men in positions of leadership who have been resistant and who have not been held accountable for that resistance. To me, the global game changer on this issue, in terms of prevention, I'm talking about prevention of domestic abuse, sexual assault, sexual harassment. The global game changer is defining it as a leadership expectation and not a hope. And that means that everybody, men, women, and others who are in positions of leadership, institutionally, politically, and every other way, or they're aspiring to those positions, need to know that they're going to be expected to have basic competencies about supporting victims and survivors, about interrupting abuse and holding abusers accountable, whatever that means, and creating a climate and within their domain, within the environment, in which abusive behavior is seen as completely contrary to the group's values, and the person who's in charge, the CEO of the company, the head of the labor union, the principal of the high school, the coach of the athletic team, etc., is the person most responsible for setting that tone. And then we have to have training for those people, because we can't just say, you need to go out there and be this great leader, when in fact lots of men in positions of leadership don't have any of the skills to do the leadership in a really effective way. And what ends up happening is a lot of really powerful men, powerful on other issues and articulate on other issues, and strong leaders on other issues. When it comes to issues of gender equality and gender violence prevention, all of a sudden become inarticulate, all of a sudden don't even know what to say, can't even string together sentences without stumbling. And so what they end up doing is then deferring to women and then delegating authority to women. And they'll say things like, oh, this is a really important subject, but Ms. Jones really, this is her area and she knows this better than I, so I'm going to give her the platform. And they think that they're discharging their responsibility in that way. And my argument is, what the message they're sending to young men in that room is that it's a women's issue. It's not really about men. It's really about women. And what the message is sending to young women? It's really women's have to shoulder the burden for this. And gender violence prevention is really a women's concern. And yes, we need some men who help out those women, but as men, that's not really our domain. To me, flipping the script on that one, this is a reframe, is to me the game changer. And by defining it as a leadership issue, it's positive and aspirational. And by the way, men can't opt out of it. If you're a man who's in a position of leadership, you can't say, I'm going to go support this event. I'm going to go to this event because my friend who's my woman colleague who organized this event, I'm going to support her by going. It's like, I'm sorry, that's not a good enough, that's not a transformative model. If however, it's said that because you're a leader, you have to go to training, you have to be educated on this subject matter, they might have their arms folded. They might say things like, why do we just have to sit through another male bashing session where we're going to be told that we're toxic? It doesn't matter how they walk through the door. They're going to walk through the door. And what happens when they walk through the door is they're going to realize how little they knew about something that they thought they knew about. And they're going to start learning all these things like men's violence against women is connected to men's violence against other men, and all these things that I've been talking about and we've been discussing, and that your show highlights, all the time, all these different complexities to men's experiences. But they have to walk through the door, and keeping it voluntary, keeping it something that men can choose to do or not do, is not a transformative model. We've been doing this work for decades, and we know that there's only a small number of men who actually sign up to be part of some of this work, voluntarily sign up. And if we say in our societies that this is a priority, and again, the show Adolescence, getting lots of people talking about how it's a priority to address these issues. And you have the Prime Minister of the UK on the floor of Parliament saying how important this is. If it's a priority, then it shouldn't be optional. And I know the word mandatory. A lot of people they back away from the term mandatory. So I would just say we have to build it in organically into normative educational practice and leadership training expectation.
It's really interesting how you talk about this idea of leadership and perhaps encourage us to think a bit differently about that. Because of course, the last time we had you on the podcast, we did speak primarily about the political situation in the United States. And I guess so much of what you said back then about the ways in which ideas about masculinity were being exploited by kind of conservative forces in the country and the risks of authoritarianism. Unfortunately, so much of what you said has proved to be incredibly prescient. So I guess we were just wondering, what is your sense now of how men in the country are responding to the kind of narratives that are coming from figures like Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, about what real men should be like?
Wow. I mean, oh my God. It's an absolute disaster. Okay, the Trump 2.0, Trump 1.0 was a disaster, but this is much worse. And let's just say it again. MAGA is a men's movement. Right-wing populism is a men's movement. One of the animating energies behind the rise of right-wing populism, both in the United States and in Europe and other parts of the world, is not just racial animus or white racial grievance or opposition to immigration and ethnic diversification, although it's that too. It's also a reaction against feminist challenges to male centrality and white male centrality, and the LGBTQ challenges to heteronormative centrality. And what it gets left out of the conversation so often is that piece. It's like, so we could talk about, like, for example, the racism of the Trumpist project or the right-wing populist project. And that's an incredibly important piece of it. But it's also a hyper-masculine project. And unfortunately, young men voted for Donald Trump. 18 to 29-year-old men voted for Donald Trump, which confounds the analysis that many of us had been sort of thinking about over the last 25 years or so, that the generational change, as young men are coming of age, they're becoming more accepting of gender fluidity, of sort of breaking down traditional ideologies about masculine performance and obviously the gender binary and breaking that down. And that's, by the way, some of that stuff is still happening, but young men voted for Donald Trump. And one of the reasons why they voted for Donald Trump is because his campaign was marketing itself to young men as the men's movement and as the men's party. He went on all these podcasts hosted by, Joe Rogan is obviously the most famous, but he went on a whole bunch of podcasts with huge young male audiences. And they weren't even talking policy. They were just hanging out. And Kamala Harris campaign didn't do any of that with the male podcasters, and I'm not blaming her loss on that, but I mean I do think that was indicative of the cluelessness of in my country of the Democratic Party's understanding of how to speak to men and young men, and they've had this problem for the last several decades. And Trump emerges in 2016 just like an over-the-top kind of cartoonish performance of masculinity, and he just steamrolled through the American political system, and he's won huge majorities of the white male vote, especially the high school educated white male vote. And if the Democrats can't, and the progressive and liberals and the Democratic Party can't figure out how to speak to young men and young white working class men in a way that they feel heard and listened to and their needs are being taken account of, we're in deep trouble. We're already in deep trouble because of Trump being reelected, but we're in deep trouble getting out of this situation. And I think it's complicated by class, right? So much of this narrative is complicated by class because there is a major class divide in the United States, with high school educated men being much more right wing politically, and college educated or university educated white men being much less so. And that's also true with women and white women in particular. White women, university educated white women voted overwhelmingly for Kamala Harris, but high school educated white women voted for Donald Trump. So there's a class dimension that has to be talked about, intersectionality, that has to be acknowledged and discussed. And so some of this has to do with the Democratic Party moving to the left politically and being more responsive explicitly, not just policy-wise, but even narratively and rhetorically to working class concerns, which is why Bernie Sanders is still so popular and gets huge audiences, because he explicitly just goes right at it. Can I also say, I was one of the co-founders of the Young Men Research Project, which is, we're still going, and we're trying to figure out ways to both compile information and data and push policymakers certainly and democratic strategists to take all this stuff seriously and do it better than they did. They were outspent 10-1, by the way. The Democrats were outspent among young men 10-1 in the 2024 election. And guess what? Donald Trump won the young men's vote, and it could have been the decisive factor in the election. The Young Men Research Project and thinking about young men, one of the hopeful signs here is that when it comes to issues, young men are generally liberal and progressive. This is confounding, especially to people around the world who don't really get American politics that well. It's like young men, at the same time that they say that they're two-thirds of them are pro-choice on abortion rights, a very strong majority support strong labor unions. They support increases in the minimum wage, action on the climate crisis. And many of them voted for Donald Trump. It's like, so if you believe in all those policy positions, how do you vote for Donald Trump? The reason they vote for Donald Trump is because it's about identity. It's not about issues. It's not about their political position on a well thought out issues. It's about like the Trump party is the party of men. And if you listen to Fox, watch Fox News, and news in quotes, right? Air quotes. If you listen to right-wing podcasts and you pay attention to right-wing media, which I do, and I have been doing since I was in my 20s, they constantly mock and ridicule the masculinity of men in the Democratic Party, men who are identified as liberal or progressive. They don't just differ with them on policy. They mock their masculinity. They do it openly. And by the way, Jordan Peterson also does it. So Jordan Peterson does it. I mean, Andrew Tate is the more exaggerated version of it. But if you watch Fox News, and Pete Hegseth, now the Secretary of Defense, who's in big trouble on the Signalgate scandal, when he was a commentator and was writing, he actually wrote books as well. He would be one of those guys mocking men who are on the progressive side of the house as being failed men. Who are, it's not that I don't agree with them politically, it's that I think that they're wimpy and soft. That's literally what young men are barraged with on a daily basis. And if you're a young guy you don't take courses at university on gender or women's studies or whatever, but you're on social media. You do listen to Joe Rogan. You hear things. You watch short clips of Charlie Kirk debating a 20-year-old college student who can't articulate a progressive position very well. And Charlie Kirk seems like he's a genius because he can dismantle their arguments, which drives me crazy. Charlie Kirk is a very prominent American right-wing young man who's the head of Turning Point USA, which is a very far-right student-based organization that's mobilized millions of voters and young people for Donald Trump and for the MAGA movement. So if you're a young guy who hasn't done all the other like sort of downloading of information and taking these, like I said, these courses and reading these books, and all you hear is that feminists hate men, especially white men, that MAGA is the party of real men. You might not agree with him on all the issues, but Donald Trump is a businessman, he's getting tough with immigration, or Elon Musk, who's Iron Man, you know what I mean? He's Tony Stark and he's like a real life superhero and he's going to come in and solve our problems. I'd say one other point of hope is that Elon Musk is really unpopular at this moment. And I think a lot of people are pushing back, including a lot of white blue-collar men who are losing their jobs, including veterans who are losing their jobs that are just being cut, not based on merit or anything, just completely cut based on Elon Musk's, chainsaw cuts to government programs. And these men are outraged. And I wish they had been outraged earlier when the political system was hurting people, vulnerable women and children and people of color. But let's hear their voice now and get them to be part of a progressive movement that fights back against this, because working people across the board, men, women, and others, are being screwed by the oligarchy mobilizing in many cases blue collar men who are doing their bidding. And I think if we frame it that way, do you want to be the guy who, supports tax breaks for billionaires while you're barely feeding your family? Or do you want to be someone who joins a progressive movement that cuts across lines of race and ethnicity and all the, gender expression and ideologies and beliefs, and joins together and fights back and trying to build a healthier society? And I think that's where hope lies.
Well, talking about leadership, Jackson, I'm very grateful for the leadership you've shown in our field, and also for the role you're playing in the resistance in the United States, because I think that's just incredibly important, really, isn't it? So so thank you so much for the work you do and for speaking to us today.
Yes, and thanks from me too. I mean, we don't so far hear too much about the resistance actually in the US, so it's interesting to hear that part too. I know we're only 2 months in, so let's see what happens, but. Clearly, if you're right, then this is going to grow over time.
It will, but we have to face our fear, and I think the fear that many men have, women, men, everybody. I'm not saying it's exclusive to men, but I would say the fear that men have being outed as unmanned if they express vulnerability, or if they identify with feminism or women's concerns like we've been talking about. These are real fears, and I think that in this moment, it's like what those of us who are doing this work, and I said this to you guys last time when you were on my, I was on your show. I mean, we need to like scale up, and I think this is one of the reasons why I think your podcast is so important. And I think why it's so important that a mainstream publisher just published my book. And by the way, we couldn't find a publisher in the United States until recently. Now we have a publisher. It's my book, Every Man, is being published by Bloomsbury Publishing in September. But just think about that. Not one. I'll frame it positively. We have a publisher, and it's coming out in September. But the point is, I think we have to say to people, if you're going to be silent now, when are you going to speak up? If you can't speak up now, if you can't, and as all these vulnerable people are being attacked by this sort of male-dominated system, this hyper-masculine machine that's rolling over people in the name of somehow that's the manly thing to do, which to me is absurd. If you can't speak up in that moment, when can you speak up? And I think we all have to figure out ways that we can take the messages that we have, the knowledge that we have, to a broader audience, because as I've said, and as I know that from my own personal experience, when you get more people to hear some of these ideas, you start building a movement, and you start building way beyond the confines of what historically has been the pro-feminist men's movement. You can build a much broader sort of acceptance of these ideas, but you have to get out there, and people, people aren't going to come to you until they hear you come to them. And that's why I'd say anybody within the sound of my voice or our voice in this podcast who has a platform, think about how you can magnify it now more than ever. But thanks again for this opportunity. I appreciate it very much.
Well, thanks for speaking to us so powerfully. And, I can only reinforce the message you've just given us, really, and send that to the listeners. Do what you can. Get out there. Yeah. Speak out.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks
Jackson.
so much.
Thank you so much, guys.
That's, I think, our third show in a row where men's violence has been a core element to our conversation. So we've really been digging quite deep into that. But in terms of, our piece at the end here, I think it'd be interesting to have a quick chat about adolescence, really, because it is the show of the moment. So do you want to just kick off and say something about your reactions to that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think I just want to pay tribute to Jackson, and his kind of, his awe-inspiring passion and commitment and dedication to this work, and the bravery he shows in doing that. I think is very inspiring. But yeah, it does feel like we're in this really important moment right now, doesn't it? That so many people are talking about the issues that we're talking about on this podcast, like in wider society, and I think that's fantastic. Really, I think we need that. And I think that Adolescence has done something really great there, obviously it was something that was already being talked about, because of all sorts of different reasons, but I think it feels like it's reached the stratosphere in some ways, doesn't it? And I guess maybe that can feel a bit frustrating at times, because sometimes it feels like, people are drawing quite simplistic conclusions. Because, for example, it took me a little while to actually get around to watching Adolescence. And but I couldn't help but read all of these takes about it on social media and stuff. But then having actually eventually watched it myself, I kind of felt like, well, a lot of those felt quite simplistic to me. Like honing in on one aspect of it as if that's the story that it has to tell. When actually, for me, I think the most profound thing about it was the fact that it indicted all of us, the whole of society. I feel like it was really showing like how every part of society and each one of us is kind of failing our children, really. We're failing our boys because we're bringing them up in this world where they're expected to be dominating and aggressive and in control and all of these things, these really unhealthy expectations being placed on them. We're obviously failing girls, that they're just having to deal with this kind of abuse on a day-to-day basis. And that's so many different parts of society. have a responsibility there, right? And so many parts of society are failing our children, whether that is the internet, social media, pornography, politicians for failing to really do much to address the root causes of this, parents perhaps not feeling the courage to talk to their children about it, teachers, schools, it's everywhere, isn't it? And I think I really felt that at the end. I was just like, this really is showing how we're not doing enough as a society, and we all should feel some culpability there, I think. Yeah, what did you think about it?
But when you talk about we as a society, it's difficult, isn't it? Because in a way, if everybody's responsible, then nobody's responsible.
Absolutely.
It's like who's going to do what? But I think it just showed us so many different elements, didn't it? I mean, there was obviously a progression between the shows as well. From show 1 was about policing, show 2 was about school, show 3 was the encounter between the child, the boy and the psychologist, and show 4 was primarily about the family, and in particular the father. And so you're right, there's so many different components to this story. But I mean, one of the things that I would pick out is and I'm interested in is the core relationship which is presented is really about father-son, and obviously there are other pieces of work which are around. We mentioned Sir Gareth Southgate's Dimbleby lecture, which partly was about boys and how we bring them up, and what kind of qualities are we trying to foster in boys. And I felt, in one way, the mother was fairly silent, and the girl also in the family, perhaps because the dad was somewhat controlling. There were intimations that he'd been violent in the past, and his response in episode 4, was pretty extraordinary, really. But I suppose my point here is that I worry about this focus on this sort of unique magic relationship between fathers and sons, as if there's something wholly different about that, whereas actually it's about the family, and the family as a system in which everybody is a participant. And very often, the mother can be in inverted commas, role model, positive role model. Very often is. I mean, for example, in families where the father isn't even there. And conversely, boys and girls can grow up in families where the dad is violent himself, I mean, it was interesting. They didn't choose that in this story. I thought that was quite clever.
Yeah.
But, it does ask questions about that whole sort of male role model thesis, that this is the way that we sort boys out, and also the notion that there are particular qualities that attach to masculinity, that they, I don't know, should be courageous, risk-taking, whatever. Whereas these, in a sense, are human qualities, aren't they, which we all can have. So, anyway, that's just a few initial reflections.
Absolutely. Yeah, I guess maybe in the last episode, I feel like maybe implicitly sometimes it felt like it was kind of saying, or my interpretation was that, that maybe we need to allow a bit more space to actually hear what women and girls have to say, to let them influence things more, that it's not about men just taking control all the time, because look where that has left us, so often. And just to go back to what you said at the beginning, it can be immobilizing, can't it? Because obviously, there are so many huge issues at play here, which can feel, out of our control. But I think that, to go back to Jackson's book, I suppose, right? Like, rather than letting it kind of just lead us to freeze and feel like there's nothing we can do. If anything, it isn't, maybe the message is that we all do have something that we can do here, right? We can all play a part in creating a more healthy, inclusive, supportive, caring society for all of our children, and that we all have to start doing that more in any way we can, and I think Jackson's book really gets that message across powerfully, doesn't it? But I would say as well, I think there is a particular responsibility on policymakers, that obviously they have a lot of power, and we should be doing so much more in terms of prevention work in schools, and everywhere in society, and that has to come from the top partly, doesn't it? So hopefully Adolescence will lead to some progress there.
And what did you think about the notion of whether it should be shown in schools or not? Because that's quite contentious. I mean, I suppose I was thinking, well, maybe I could imagine in sort of sixth form or something, when you're doing relationship education or civics or whatever it is, that it could provide a forum for discussing quite powerfully the issues that come up. But I also take Jackson's point that what happens at home is critical, and that relationship is at the core of this. And the other thing, just to add to that, is there has been a lot of media chatter about the sort of internet dimension or backdrop to the story. And I don't know, I kind of feel that, the online and the real world, they are interrelated, and they are shaping children's experience in ways that we're only really sort of grappling with now.
Yeah.
And so I don't think we should ignore the online dimension.
No.
I think we should just see it as interrelated with real life,
Absolutely.
if you like.
Well, and it showed, didn't it, the lack of understanding adults often have of the online world that children are growing up in. I think it's complicated, isn't it? I agree with you. I think it could be shown in schools in a way that could instigate conversation, obviously if that was done in a kind of appropriate setting and stuff. So I think if it was being used to start a deeper conversation, then I have no problem with that. But I think I would have a problem with it being used, just to show kids, and then that's it. That's the end of it. Because I think again, I think the program itself was kind of critiquing that, wasn't it? That there was even a moment in the school, where one of the teachers was basically just showing the kids a film, and that was what the lesson was. And I feel like the program is kind of critiquing the fact that we as adults we just aren't talking to our children about these things, are we? We're too scared or too busy or distracted to actually just sit down and have some of these deep, meaningful conversations. And ultimately, showing a TV series can't replicate that, I guess.
Yeah. I really have this feeling that we should shut up now, Steve.
I think we've gone on for too long, not for the first time.
Yes. Oh dear.
But yes, plenty more to talk about. Perhaps you can all take that off into your own lives to discuss that further. But yes, thank you so much, as always, for listening. And we'll be back with another episode soon.
Yeah, thanks for listening. Bye for now.
Take care. Bye-bye. Bye.